All right, guys, Trevor Hunter here with Dirt Bike Test. We have Brent Farrell, one of our senior kind of test riders, and today we're talking about the 2023 Honda CRF450RX. So this is their competition off-road race bike. It's very similar to the CRF450R motocross bike, with just a few kind of off-road specific features like the 18-inch rear wheel, big tank, revised suspension settings, some slightly different ECU settings as well. Mainly just to kind of just tailor it just enough to the off-road crowd that it fits that need, but not get too far away from the motocross bike that it doesn't feel, super racy. Yeah, so this bike actually got quite a few changes, a lot of motor changes as well as chassis changes to their whole goal was to kind of increase the rideability and just make it a little more of a kind of friendlier machine. And I'd say overall they did just that, coming from the 2021, 22, 22 model. So kind of starting off with the power, what do you think of the power?
I think it's got a great motor. It's certainly motocross oriented, but it's off-road friendly. It's linear. It's relatively easy to ride. It's still a 450, so it pulls hard and will do a lot when asked for it. But it's pretty easy to manage, especially for somebody who's just familiar with with 450 torque. I think generally it's one of the class. It's one of my favorite motors because it's easy to ride. It doesn't have a huge hit anywhere that tends to unsettle the bike, especially when you're talking about powerful machines like a 450. So it makes it for a bike that you can ride really aggressive, but when the need is there, you can ride through some technical trails and without feeling like you're one slight twitch of your right wrist away from making huge mistakes. So I think the motor wise, I'm really happy with this bike, and I've enjoyed the time I've put on it. And I think they've found a good compromise for the specific focus of this.
Yeah, I'd agree, especially because you rode that 2017 to 2020 generation, and that motor was much more of a handful. Whereas this, still has the power and the torque and everything, but it's much more controlled and much easier to manage.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to race that previous generation RX, and I came away feeling like I was struggling to ride it in an off-road environment. It was so aggressive, especially for somebody who's not a 20-year-old pro. I felt like a little out of sorts on that bike a lot. So I was very happy to feel the difference of this new generation bike, and it definitely fit into what I considered an off-road style bike, much more so than the last version.
Yeah, I'd say too, being this is more of a motocross oriented model, it's definitely suited for like Western GP off-road conditions. I think if you go maybe GNCC style or kind of the mountain single track, it's definitely not, I'd say, as friendly up there. Biggest thing is almost like a light flyweight feel or flywheel weight feel, whereas it revs up a little quicker, be a little more prone to stalling as well in that technical sections if you're not kind of covering the clutch. So if you're in that kind of riding, be aware of that. But for sure, for this kind of West Coast off-road, even motocross track, whatever, power plant is really good on this bike.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think it stays pretty close to its motocross roots.
Yep.
And in fact, I would probably go so far as to say that when you're in a prepped motocross environment, whether it's a tight, technical, jumpy motocross track or something like here in Glen Helen, it's a little more open and high speed. It feels very much at home, in that on those prep tracks. And I think as we start getting into talking about chassis a little bit, that's where its motocross roots become a little bit more apparent when you get it into some of the slippery, dry, rutted, choppy, the environments you see in an off-road race. We found it to be a pretty sensitive bike. Its chassis, I think, is more rigid than some, and so that translates to a bike that works well when everything is the way it should be. But we found, as we've tuned it and made minor tweaks, you get it into some of those conditions that are that don't have that type of a traditional motocross environment, like some of the ridges here at Glen Helen and during one of the races that we used this bike in. It was a little less comfortable in that stuff. It moved around a little more, deflected a little bit more, some of that I think is suspension settings, but I think a lot of that comes down to, like I said, it's a rigid motocross focused chassis, and when you get a motocross bike in some of those conditions, it's gonna feel a little different than maybe the X model of this bike that would probably feel very comfortable on the same trail.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a precise, kind of lighter feeling, kind of more agile. You can move around a lot easier, but it's also prone to being thrown around a lot easier, kind of in those wrong conditions.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of more the chassis feel on this Honda. You get a little more feedback to the rider, and it's one of those bikes where you feel a lot of the ground kind of underneath you, good and bad. And we've kind of found that this bike likes traction and it likes rounder bumps. As the traction goes away and as the bumps get sharper and kind of more squared out, this is where that bike I wouldn't say lack, but it just responds to that kind of unfavorably to some of our riders. But there are some of our test riders who still love it in those conditions as well.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that it starts just becoming a bit of a differentiator between some of the other platforms. You ride these off-road 450s back to back, you're going to pick up these differences, and that's one of the nice things. There's so many great bikes to choose from. Some of those choppy sections where some of the riders, myself included, felt like the Honda was a little unsettled through there. That some of that's my preference, my size, my ability. We've had a variety of people give different feedback, and I think we're trying to share like a little bit of kind of what the perspective was across the board, trying to represent a lot of different riders. But generally, we noticed that the Honda is probably at a little bit more towards moto than off-road compared to some of the other bikes. So it kind of depends on what the rider is looking for. Anything, Trevor, as far as like some of the ergos or obviously look at the two of us, we have dramatically different requirements or preferences from a cockpit perspective.
Yep.
The Honda, I'll say one thing, is the stock seat was not something I enjoyed. And I think that was one thing. Well, we've had opinions across the board, different things. I like this, don't like that, not only about the Honda, but the every bike. The one thing that everybody wasn't happy with was the stock seat. It's very thin.
Yep.
You feel it. You feel the frame below you, at times. And we pretty quickly opted to put a guts seat on it that's a little taller than stock. That worked great for me, especially because I'm taller than the average rider. Trevor, I don't think you liked the tall seats so much, mostly because of your size.
Yep.
But even so, I would guess you probably didn't love the stock seat either that much.
No, I'm right there with you. Like the guts seat, I do actually like, although kind of my size it makes it hard to kind of adjust to it. I do like tall seats on a lot of these bikes, whether I can touch the ground or not, just simply because kind of having that flat seat, it's a lot easier to kind of move around, especially on the motocross track or in corners. It's a lot easier to move from front to back or back to front. And so I kind of like the tall seats in that way. I know one of the other big changes we did make is we put these Fastway Evo foot pegs on in the lower position. And for myself, I didn't feel the need for them, but a lot of just our average height riders from 5'10", 5'11" up all felt that was a huge benefit. Kind of the stock foot peg position did feel a little high to most of our riders, so even just running the stock seat height, but putting those lowered pegs on seemed to help a lot for a lot of you guys.
Yeah, and it certainly made a big difference for me. I felt much more comfortable. I mean, I can adapt my style to manage a tighter, more compact layout, like pretty much all the bikes are. But opening it up a little bit just gives you a level of comfort, and also too, it keeps you from abusing your legs. You're not doing quite the same, deep knee bends the same way you'd be on a stock bike. And so I think that change on this was pretty much across the board. All the riders that we've had on it, I think most, aside from maybe you, favored that. Yeah. So I think that was a good change. And but it's also that's one of those things that is very much just personal preference and trying to fine tune a bike for your particular needs. If you're 5 feet tall, the last thing you're going to want is a tall seat. I don't care how hard or shape is wrong, whatever it may be, you're not going to want a tall seat. And same with me, I'm always putting, whether it's a tall seat or low pegs or something on the bike to make accommodations for, for my size.
Yeah, I say generally across the board, both of those, but for sure the lowered pegs seem to be the positive.
Yeah.
So kind of a couple other kind of minor changes, but actually made a really big difference on this bike coming off the showroom was changing the tires and changing the handlebars. So Brent was actually here with us on the very first day we rode it and wasn't too impressed, and I was kind of struggling with the bike setup as well. And the bike comes with Dunlop AT81 tires front and rear, and one of the first changes we made was we put just a Dunlop MX33 or even an MX53, whatever your preference is, but we put an MX33 on the front, and right away it just completely changed the whole motorcycle. The AT81 has kind of a stiff sidewall feel, so you get a lot of feedback, got a lot of deflection, and I think the traction isn't all that great either, kind of for our conditions. So going to that MX33 went from a bike I kind of wanted to just kind of ride off just right away, and I kind of didn't really gel with it or wasn't really having fun with it, to okay, I'm riding on something I can work with, and I really just brought that bike to life.
Absolutely. I was shocked the difference that we felt with just making some very minor adjustments, and it went from a bike that I really was struggling to find some comfort on to one that I really enjoyed riding. And I think when we rode them all back to back, the Honda was my second choice as far as the way I stack ranked them. And that was just after making, just basic modern or minor, I should say, adjustments. Tires were one. I think we did just some very few clicker adjustments just to kind of get us in the ballpark for the type of terrain we were riding on. I think that also that was a few months ago we were doing that, but it did sort of kind of set the stage for what we'd see from this bike going forward. Is those small changes made a big difference.
Yes.
We made, when we raced this bike in the 10 hours of Glen Helen endurance race here, and in the middle of the race, we were really chasing some kind of front end feel, just especially in the conditions outside of the track. When it's slippery and dry and not prepped, and we were really struggling for some front end feel and just kind of getting that comfort. And we made a minor change, 5 millimeters, pushing the forks down 5 millimeters. And I was shocked at how much of an effect it had on the bike in a positive way. And everybody on the team, we had 4 guys riding on that team, everybody went out the next time on their bike, on that bike or this bike, and were shocked at how much that minor change, how much of an improvement it made. So once again, kind of comes back to, it's a sensitive bike, so those little tweaks can have dramatic effects. And I guess it's up to the individual to determine, if they want a bike that's that sensitive, if they want to be able to have that big of an effect, if clickers and ride height, sag on the back and fork position on the front will make that much of a change.
Yeah.
But it makes for some fun testing.
Yes.
You can go out and make some adjustments that are no cost adjustments. Go out there and try to fine tune the bike to your liking.
Yep, no, for sure. And kind of just a couple other minor changes we made were, went from a Renthal handlebar that comes stock to a Pro Taper handlebar, and kind of like that front tire, it just kind of softened the initial hit a little more flex, a little more comfort in the front end. And then another thing we made was we made a gearing change on this bike, and stock is 1350, and while the power is good, it revs up pretty quick, and especially in an off-road kind of environment, here on the West Coast especially, you just you rev out and kind of run out of gear really quick on some of those faster courses and faster straightaways. So we went from 1350 to like a 1452, and that's kind of to be a similar gear ratio to the 1350. I think after having raced it more, we could probably even go down to 1450 or 1451 just to kind of let it rev out a little more top speed. But kind of that lengthened the power and smoothened it out, which was a positive for a lot of our riders. And also, when you kind of smoothened out that power, it smoothed out the chassis a little bit as well. So it kind of helped us on both ends, where we wanted more broad kind of usable power from top to bottom, as well as this kind of softer, smoother chassis feel for when it gets edgy and kind of the conditions aren't ideal, and that gearing made a big difference in that way too.
Yeah, and then we've got a couple races on the horizon. We're going to continue to play around with this, make a few more modifications, try a few different things. We're going to be riding it in a night race actually coming up, and then in the 24 hours of Glen Helen as well. So we'll be continuing to develop it and come up with settings that we feel are really, you know, kind of applicable for the types of riding that are here in the West Coast. And we'll be providing some more feedback to anybody who's watching these videos and reading the articles. So look forward to seeing more.
Yeah, so stay tuned, Dirt Bike Test. So always follow us on Instagram, Facebook, our website, of course. We have a lot of our testing stuff that aren't just videos, a lot of articles as well. Find us on Instagram, myself, Trevor Hunter 224. Hit me up there for any questions. Trevor at dirtbiketest.com. You can email me. I'd be happy to answer and kind of give you as much information as I can. But until then, we'll see you out on the trail.